Back in the late 19th and early 20th century, steam locomotives were the largest vehicle that transported people and merchandise. The crew who ran and maintained these engines would become very accustomed to these locomotives. Anyone who has worked on a steam locomotive can tell you that these aren't machines, they're living and breathing beasts. However, those who run these beasts have to be careful when running these machines. One simple mistake could take the life of the entire train and everyone on it. A steam locomotive works when wood, coal, or any kind of fuel is put into the firebox. The firebox is basically a big metal box in where the fuel burns, which creates heat and boils the water inside of the boiler. The boiled water produces steam, which collects in the steam dome. From there, a series of piping leads the steam either straight to the cylinders or through superheaters to the cylinders. When the steam is in the cylinders, it expands under pressure and pushes the cylinder head, which moves a series of rods, which in turn moves the wheels. If the engine has no fuel in the firebox to make enough heat, the firebox sheets will cool, therefore not making steam, and the locomotive will run out of steam pressure. However, if the engine has no water in the boiler, the firebox sheets will have nothing to cool them. The firebox sheets, more specifically the crown sheet, will heat beyond its melting point and weaken to the point where the pressure inside the boiler will quickly expand, pushing it out on the boiler and thus exploding. The crown sheet is the top sheet in the firebox. Without the crown sheet, the firebox wouldn't be separate from the rest of the boiler. A boiler explosion is the worst thing that can happen to a steam locomotive, and in almost all cases, kills the crew in the cab. Sometimes, engines that get boiler explosions can get rebuilt and run again. Unfortunately, some engines are not as lucky and get scrapped afterwards. Thankfully, boiler explosions didn't happen often, and railroads would keep the steam engines until diesels came to replace them. However, sometimes boiler explosions are the cause of the end of steam on a railroad, and it's easy to say that this particular incident changed steam on the Empire Builder forever.
In the 1940s, steam power, which had defined railroads, started to fade into history. The diesel locomotive had made its mark on the industry and was starting to phase out steam. Passenger power would be demoted to lesser duties first, and freight engines were quick to follow. The Great Northern, however, was one of those railroads that kept steam on their top priority express trains until new streamlined equipment would replace the heavy Pullman stock. The GN would use several types of locomotives in passenger duty, but the ones that were the most famous were their S2 class 484s. On numerous other railroads, the 484 would go by many names, namely the Northern type, but in the Pacific Northwest, the Great Northern would call their Northerns Montanas, after the largest state that they traveled through. In total, 14 S2 Montanas would be built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1930, bearing the numbers 2575 to 2588. Engine 2581 was a part of the first batch of S2s and was built in February of 1930. The engine would have a length of over 103 feet, a width of 11 feet, and a height towering to over 16 feet tall. With a boiler pressure of 220 psi, saddled on 80-inch drivers, and 29 by 29-inch square cylinders, the Montanas produced 58,035 pounds of tractive effort. Although this was low traction compared to the size of these engines, this would be perfect for the Great Northern's premier passenger train, the Empire Builder. The Empire Builder was a first-class passenger train running between Seattle, Washington and Chicago, Illinois. The route would also split up in Spokane, Washington, and head down to Portland, Oregon. Thanks to the engine's tall 80-inch drivers, the Montanas would be seen going over 100 miles an hour on a regular basis, making them perfect for the tasks that they were assigned. However, 2581 would have a shorter life than her siblings.
On January 9th, 1947, just over 77 years ago, the 2581 would depart from St. Paul, Minnesota, heading westbound at 9:18 a.m., pulling the first section of the Empire Builder passenger train with 60-year-old engineer Reginald Bennett, 30-year-old fireman Wilbert Hoff, and 35-year-old supervising roadmaster Irvin Zinter. The consist would consist of one dormitory car, 2 tour sleepers, 2 dining cars, 6 standard sleepers, and a club car at the end. The engine would be rated for 17 cars in this district, but left with 11 at this time. Everything seemed to be in good shape for the first 320 miles, and arrived in Grand Forks, North Dakota. The engine would get refueled, oiled, and cruise changed until departing at 5:29 p.m., running 4 minutes late. Little did the crews know that this would be their last stop.
Unfortunately, the crew did not know how much water was left in the boiler. Little did they know the water level was 2 inches above the highest level of the crown sheet, which is very low. The low water alarm then sounded off as a last loud warning, but this was silenced by the previous crews. After that, there would be nearly seconds left. Around 7:30 p.m., 2.5 miles away from Cary, North Dakota, and traveling around 60 miles per hour, the water level had dropped below the highest point on the crown sheet. The crown sheet then started to heat and buckle under extreme pressure. Not long after that, disaster unfolded. The 2581 had suffered a crown sheet failure, causing its boiler to explode. The boiler was thrown from the locomotive's frame 400 feet in the air and landed over 700 feet from the crash site. The engine's frame would be broken behind the rear set of drivers. Surprisingly, the smoke box, half of the superheater system, and front-end throttle would stay on what remained of the frame. This caused the rest of the engine, the tender, and the first 4 coaches to derail off the tracks, but stay upright. The cab and other appliances were found over 60 feet behind the point of the explosion. The 3 crew members, engineer, fireman, and roadmaster, were killed instantly when the engine exploded, and another 3 passengers were injured, but not severely.
What remained of the 2581 would be put onto flatbeds and put into storage. After the accident, the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, concluded that the crew was at fault for miscalculating how much water was left in the boiler, since all the appliances were in working order. This was due to the Great Northern putting the 2581 into a pre-departure check before the builder run, which concluded to not have any dirt or sediment scaling in the water glass or water column pipes. Whether the injector failed and the crew didn't know, or if they simply neglected the water level, is unknown. After the accident, the GN continued using steam on the Empire Builder for a month until they replaced steam fully on the Builder and put their new E7A diesels to head the new Empire Builder passenger train, which was all streamlined. The Builder would continue to be under GN ownership until 1970, when the SP&S, NP, GN, and CV&Q all merged into one railroad, known as the Burlington Northern. Then in 1971, the Empire Builder service would be taken over by Amtrak, which continues to serve as one of their main passenger trains today. As for 2581, she'd be deemed beyond repair and sold for scrap on February 4th to the Paper, Calemson and Company in St. Paul, Minnesota. Since diesels were already on the way, the GN didn't need to rebuild the engine. The other S2s would be reassigned to secondary passenger trains and freight trains until withdrawal of the class began in 1955. Then, in 1958, the last S2's fire would be dropped for the final time. The Great Northern would keep some S2s until 1963, when all but one were scrapped. Number 2584 would be restored by the Great Northern themselves and placed on static display outside the Amtrak station in Havre, Montana in 1964. The engine did receive a cosmetic restoration in the 1980s to improve its overall look of a static display. However, currently there's no plans of returning the 2584 to operational condition. It's been 77 years since this accident occurred, and with 2584 around, the 2581's accident will never be forgotten.